This video is brought to you by Nebula. 2 weeks ago, China's statistical authorities released their economic data for the first quarter of 2023. As we explained in our video at the time, while we might have some questions about their reliability, the numbers were generally pretty good. Year-on-year GDP growth came in higher than expected, at 4.5%, and it was mostly driven by household consumption, which is something the CCP have been trying to encourage for some time now. However, in and amongst all the good numbers was one very bad number, and that was China's youth unemployment rate. While unemployment across all age groups actually fell from 5.6% to 5.3%, the unemployment rate amongst 16 to 24-year-olds actually rose from 18 to 20%. For context, that's about double that of the UK, triple that of the US, and quadruple that of Germany. So in this video, we're going to look at China's youth unemployment crisis, why it's bad news for the CCP, and whether Xi Jinping can fix it. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's get into it. The headline here is that China's youth unemployment rate is very high. China's youth unemployment rate actually used to be pretty low. In the 90s, it hovered around 5% before increasing to about 10% in the 2000s. It was relatively stable throughout the 2010s, hovering between 9 and 11%, and then jumped up to about 12% in 2020. This was largely because of the pandemic and China's draconian zero-COVID policy, which burdened the Chinese economy. The impact was especially acute in urban areas, where unemployment amongst 16 to 24-year-olds averaged about 14%, reaching a peak of 16.8% in June 2020. Things were supposed to get better after China reopened its economy when it ditched zero COVID last year. But while the rest of China's economy seems to be on the up, youth unemployment has remained stubbornly high and actually rose to 19.6% in March, up from 18.1% in February and the second highest figure ever, which was during the massive Shanghai lockdown. Broadly speaking, there are 3 reasons for this. First, even though China's economy is recovering better than most people expected, it's still not doing great if you compare it to before the pandemic. While exports have remained strong throughout, the CCP's crackdown on certain private industries has hurt China's private sector, leading to fewer jobs. A survey last November of 100 China-based employers by 51job, a job listings website, found that more than half of respondents planned to reduce hiring in 2023. Second, China's youth unemployment rate often spikes at about this time of year, as this year's batch of college students start looking for jobs ahead of graduation season in June and July. Third, young Chinese people, much like their British and American counterparts, are suffering from what's sometimes described as underemployment. Basically because more and more Chinese people are going to university and getting more and more advanced degrees, there are just too many overqualified graduates and postgrads, and just not enough white-collar jobs for them. It's a similar story in the UK and the US, where 43% and 41% of graduates, respectively, end up in jobs that just don't require college degrees, at least in the first few years in the job market. This problem is particularly pronounced in China, because the number of graduates in China has increased tenfold in the past 2 decades, as has the number of postgrads, and many of these grads and postgrads refuse to take manual labour or blue-collar jobs. Anyway, this is obviously a problem because it upsets young Chinese people and undermines the implicit contract made between the CCP and the Chinese people. That the CCP can continue ruling without democratic checks and balances as long as they provide steady economic opportunities. It also creates an intergenerational tension between young grads, who don't think they have the same opportunities their parents had, and the older generation that often see them as ungrateful or lazy for refusing to take on low-skilled jobs. This is why in the last few months, the CCP has come up with a whole load of initiatives aimed at bringing down the youth unemployment rate. The Chinese government has announced subsidies for firms that hire younger workers and eased up on their most restrictive private sector regulations, including in the tech industry, which traditionally hires a lot of younger people. Hotels in certain provinces have even started offering free accommodation for college students looking for jobs there. Chinese state media has also been running segments encouraging grads to do blue-collar jobs, including regular profiles of college grads making six-figure salaries in low-skilled jobs. Unsurprisingly, this hasn't gone down well with most young Chinese, and a state-affiliated WeChat channel drew their ire last month when it told young graduates to, quote, take off their suits, roll up their sleeves, and go to the farmland. So, will all these measures work? Can the Chinese government bring down youth unemployment? Well, these are pretty significant measures, and the CCP are usually pretty effective when it comes to directing their economy. But the headwinds aren't blowing their way. For starters, there are more graduates in the pipeline. Not only are there already 35 million or so students currently enrolled in graduate studies, but because the job market isn't great at the moment, more and more Chinese are applying for postgraduate degrees. According to the Chinese Ministry of Education, nearly 5 million Chinese enrolled for postgraduate degrees in 2023, which is more than double what it was just 5 years ago. But perhaps more significantly, China's export-driven economy is going to struggle to maintain its rapid growth rate, as its largest export market, like the US and Europe, takes steps to reduce their dependence on China. While the precise extent to which China and the West are actually decoupling is debated, geopolitical tension will probably drag on the Chinese economy in the coming years, which will make it harder for Beijing to achieve the rapid levels of economic growth required to sustain such a heavy influx of graduates. Again, we're not saying it's impossible, and the CCP have proven remarkably adept at keeping the Chinese people happy for the past few decades. But it's not going to be easy either. And if you've made it this far, you're probably pretty interested in global politics, so you'll definitely enjoy the Modern Conflict series. That's a show made by our friends over at Real Life Law, where they break down recent conflicts from around the world, including the Ethiopian civil war and the war in Ukraine, which we've discussed a bunch before in TLDR's videos, as well as things like the US's invasion of Afghanistan and the Turkey-Greek Cold War. It's an incredible series, and it's only available on our streaming service, Nebula. You'll find a bunch of TLDR stuff on Nebula too. Every weekday we post an extended version of our show, The Daily Briefing, exclusively on Nebula, giving you bonus discussions and explainers. On Sundays, we release our show This Week in Parliament, which summarises the week's goings-on in Westminster, only on Nebula. Throughout the week, we released videos earlier on Nebula than on YouTube. Every video on Nebula is ad-free, which means that this isn't even here. And most importantly, signing up to Nebula is the best way to support TLDR and all the creators building the platform. It's also super cheap, just a couple of pounds a month. So if you want all of that incredible stuff, then please do sign up using the link in the description.